The issue of finance have now popped up in different contexts, and I think there's two very important key findings in this technical report. You follow them up, 14 and 15, and I'm going to sort of paraphrase them a little bit. The one key finding, 14, talks to the importance of strategically deploying international public finance as a prime enabler for action. That's on the one hand. On the second hand, it says, while public finance may be deployed to incentivize high impact investment and to crowd in private sector finance, global and domestic capital markets are likely to be the primary source of capital for scaling up mitigation adaptation. So on the one hand, we've got the importance of international public finance as a trigger and to do what government should be doing. But on the other hand, the key finding 15 says that upscaling is likely to be global and domestic capital markets. This also links to a statement by Dr. Sultan Al-Jaber around the opportunities of climate action. And I think bringing these three things together, the economic opportunity, we talked around the opportunity Guy mentioned earlier on, and the interaction and the leverage between international public finance and the global and domestic capital markets. How do we deploy these? How do we incentivize these to work together to get the maximum mitigation adaptation output? Again, complicated question, but any thoughts are welcome. Who'd like to have a go?
Well, I kind of alluded to it in my previous answer. Sorry, I jumped the gun a bit. But just a completely different thought. I find it really humorous in the lead up to each COP how countries to a degree, but definitely big companies are all suddenly coming up with new ambitions or new targets or new things that they're doing because they're under immense pressure to be able to say something. If they're going to go there, they need to go there with something. And so if anything is positive, is that these annual COPs kind of push and keep not just countries on their toes, but it keeps companies on their toes, and in particular the financial sector. So you're seeing more and more pledges, not just from a country perspective, but also from a financial sector as a whole perspective. And that does make me more hopeful.
Thank you. Steve? Oh, Guy, you had a hand up?
I was just going to say that maybe in the NDC's process, countries, governments could indicate their ideas about where they would be making public finance available. So put out a report on, we're going to invest X into adaptation responses in these sectors. We're going to invest Y in mitigation responses along these lines. And that would send a very clear signal to businesses in those countries and to international businesses wanting to participate. Because that, they will be putting public money into the economy to stimulate activity in those areas, create jobs, and then bring private enterprise along to bid for those funds and turn them into action. I mean, you can't expect governments to do everything, but certainly through the creation of fiscal resources, as we saw in COVID, what was possible through the supply of fiscal resources into making vaccines on what appeared to be an impossible time schedule. So we know we can do it. And so the NDC process, maybe there's a place for that. Maybe it's already in there. But it would be a very good and clear signal to the private sector.
Thank you. There's a practical suggestion for both COP delegations. Steve, anything to add?
I kind of wanted to try to bring the finance question back to a just transition. And one of the biggest drivers of inequality globally and locally is access to capital. If you're a wage earner and you are earning a wage that is increasing at lower than inflation, which is typically what is happening, you're getting poorer over time. If you're an executive or a sort of bank employee, your salary is going up faster than inflation, and you've got investments that is earning money at faster inflation, and so this inequality gap gets wider. So one of the things we have to think about in the finance discussion is how do you finance in a way that redistributes capital to people? And so we start to talk about social ownership programs. But key to this is you don't want your entire economic transition funded with foreign capital, with foreign profits, right? You want to use that foreign capital and the public spending to leverage domestic spending through the full financial services sector. So you want to see that coming out of banking, but you also want to see pension funds invested in the right places. At one point, the government employees pension fund owned 20% of the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, right? These are big amounts of money. But accepting that we have a couple of constraints. Our balance sheets are constrained, so our ability to deploy national stimulus is low. And so we need to be able to take this international support to combine with national leverage to stimulate investment in the right places. That's the one key thing. The other key thing is the capacity of our institutions to implement is constrained. So the one thing that keeps getting said about the JET agreements is that there's not enough grant. But I'm not sure that our institutions can spend grant even at the pace that we have it, right? The sort of skills challenges in local government and so on. So one of the things that we have to use the grant finance for and the support that we get is to build the capacity of institutions to take more investment, if that makes sense. So you have to build the implementation capacity alongside the early stage investments. So the question of finance and where we get it and how we leverage it is embedded in this conversation about what is a just transition.
There's another few practical examples. Anything? The other part of this leveraging public-private funds, local international funds, is what the synthesis report talks to the adaptation gap. So just to briefly recap, mitigation is about trying to make climate change less by lowering emissions and capturing carbon in some way. Adaptation is when the residual climate change that we can't mitigate, how do we adapt to that? Right? And this is typically, at the moment, we talk about extreme events, but there's also longer term effects. The challenge with adaptation is that a lot of the adaptation success stories are quite local and quite context specific. So then you end up with a bit of a disconnect between the need for large financial flows that need to have large adaptation impact, but a lot of these adaptation efforts are by nature quite local, and in some cases spending capacity that Steve talked about is quite low. So how do we bridge that gap? And this is not a new discussion. It's something that I've seen in various IPCC reports, and it pops up in a number of places. How do we balance the local relevance for impact and scaling up for progress when it comes to adaptation? And in particular, how do we unlock the financial mechanism to get that done? I know there's a global adaptation fund, there's national adaptation plans, but in my mind, there's a bit of a gap there about how do we finance this? How do we make sure that this does happen? Guy, I see you're nodding.
It's an important question, the adaptation gap. We are learning about the adaptation gap now, as you said, through the impacts of extreme events. So we really are in a learning by doing phase and will be for at least a decade or more. So number one, it's really important that we capture the lessons from extreme events and codify them and not forget them. So that's very, very important, and that could be a very powerful private-public sector partnership to capture those learnings and what is a good way to adapt and how to adjust. But I do agree a lot of adaptation is local, but if you look at adaptation happening as climate changes, all those local things are happening simultaneously. So you could predict an increase in demand for investment right across the economy as we broach a succession of climate limits, so to speak. So I think we shouldn't be fooled into thinking that adaptation is local and it's cheap. At a national strategic level, countries that adapt well will be successful over the next few decades. Countries that don't are really going to struggle. So it's enormously important that countries do get adaptation right and that we learn from each other. through this adaptation, this learning by doing phase. And I don't know, structures like the National Framework for Climate Services in South Africa is one way where we can gather these lessons. But I don't think the world is doing it in a very targeted way yet. Mm-hmm. And it's very, very urgent that we do it.
Yes. Yeah. Steve?
So 2 very quick points. One of the big challenges with financing adaptation is aggregation. So obviously your projects are much smaller and more dispersed, whereas a bank is looking for one big 500 million rand project that they can invest in. So that aggregation function is quite difficult because it's also often community level projects. The other big challenge is in adaptation, what you're effectively financing is a deferred cost and not a cash flow. And the financial system is used to thinking about cash flows. And in many cases, the benefit accrues to a different party than the costs accrue to. So my favorite example is if you think about that road from sort of the Cape Point to Gordons Bay in Cape Town, it's continually getting covered in sand dunes. And so the Department of Roads has a grader that they use to dig away the sand dunes, which costs them money, right? The cheaper option is to rehabilitate the sand dunes, right? So they don't blow over the road. But of course, now that's a different department. And one department's going to save money and one department's going to spend more money, and you have this massive budget fight, right? And no one's earning any money. You're just paying less money. So it's a much more complicated space than mitigation finance.
Ah, interesting. Tanya?
Yeah, I would agree with exactly what Steve said, particularly around scale of projects. And we saw that with the Cape Town getting to near zero. There were so many projects, but it was actually quite hard to do that funding in the end. I think that one of the good things that's come out of this need to adapt, particularly in financial services, is that they've started incorporating points into the loan agreements, which they never had before. So there's a lot more thought around long-term. What are the possible long-term impacts? I give you an example: the UPL spill in Durban a few years ago. Granted, it wasn't climate change; it was the riots. But it was because of issues around adaptation that those chemicals landed up in the rivers and into the sea. And you're still having issues with that now. Now, where does the responsibility lie? And who's going to take responsibility for cleaning up? And exactly as Steve says, is the person who's going to pay for it to clean up is not necessarily happy because they're not the people living there. So who's monitoring? And the saddest part of all is that it's always the informal sector and the vulnerable who are impacted the most. Always.
During the quick coffee break, I mentioned the something earlier that Steve mentioned around transition risk. And the transition risk at the moment is there's a number of, and I'll call them loosely, carbon border taxes. So there's a number of our international trading partners who are saying in the next 5 to 8 years, if you have carbon intensive commodities and you want to trade with us, we are going to impose some sort of tax on that. And this is not wishful thinking. This is not something into the future. The carbon border adjustment mechanism called CBAM, implemented by the European Union, is actually in a testing phase right now as of the 1st of October. And between 1st of October until February, there's certain rules in place. And then there will be a phasing in with different commodities, I think, up until 2026. But there's no doubt that this is probably a major transition risk for a number of companies with international partners or international trading partners in South Africa. How do we? What do you think is the opportunity or shall we say the likelihood of these penalties triggering national level or large company level changes in how carbon intensive their products are?
So we engage on this debate a lot as the Presidential Climate Commission. And one of the things that is hardest to deal with is we're in this weird world where we're planning for what we think the world ought to be, what we think it will be, and what we would like it to be, right? So whether we like it or not, global trade is a part of this problem. So if you think about the impacts of the Inflation Reduction Act, if you look at the Europe's Green Industrialization Plan, if you look at CBAM, there are developed countries around the world who are responsible for the majority of consumption, who are moving to protect their own industries through some kind of border trade adjustment. That has a big impact on other countries. And now you can debate about, well, who do we trade with? We'll trade with someone else. But that's not really how trade regimes works. You can't just move your trade regime, right? And so at least for the medium term, these are risks we have to be able to deal with and we have to be able to understand. And they're going to have a real impact on our economy, whether we like it or not. The issue about mistrust is obviously clear. The consistent lack of delivery from the developed world to the developing world in terms of their promises has eroded trust significantly. But I think we also need to be very careful about the narrative about who has and who hasn't built their industrialized economy on the back of coal. South Africa is in the top 20 emitters globally, historically, even adjusted for trade. So even if you take off the emissions that we've effectively sold to other people in the commodities that we produce, we're still in the top 20. So most academic studies put us on the pay-in side, not the receive side. So when they do loss and damage calculations, we're paying in. We're not getting. Now, obviously, there are other things that need to go into account other than just emissions balances. There's poverty, inequality, unemployment, of which we are amongst the worst, if not the worst, on all of those measures in the world. And so it's a very complex debate. Some of it is going to happen whether you like it or not, and so we have to plan for that. It doesn't help us to say, oh, it's not going to impact us. It is. And then we have to be very considerate about these things. So there are a bunch of studies that have been done that look at what we do as we phase out coal. We also need to have that conversation in the context of what the reality on the ground is. These are old coal-fired power plants that are not commercially profitable. And obviously you cannot close those plants unless you've put something in its place, right? Then you have enhanced load shedding, which would obviously exacerbate unemployment, inequality, and poverty. So the timing on this for us as a country is crucial. We have to make sure, and so at the PCC we talk about you can't close coal into a vacuum. And there are two vacuums. There's the power vacuum. Obviously, if there's no renewable energy or other energy sources to replace that coal, it would not be advisable to close them down. But also there's a social employment vacuum. If you haven't made the plans that need to be made to create jobs, diversify the economy in those regions, to create social support programs, you're going to have a similar challenge that you close these. And we kind of see that happening at Komati now. We closed the plant and we didn't get the timing quite right on putting alternatives in place. And so you have these disenfranchised communities. So, but not to say that you shouldn't have done it, right? This is the key. You can't delay these decisions for all that long because they're just commercially not sustainable entities. So this is complex. Timing is very important. And as a result, our least risk approach is to build that replacement infrastructure, be it renewable energy or other forms of generation, and the economic diversification and social infrastructure as quickly as we possibly can.
Thank you very much, Steve. Thoraya, I'm interested in a take on the just transition from the comment we've just heard and also from Steve's response. How is the just transition approached in your sector and in your region of the world?
So I'd like to note one element that was said today is that the concept of trust and building trust back into the system, building trust back into this process, and this is definitely something that the presidency is trying to achieve here, where we want to acknowledge historical responsibility, but at the same time, figure out how we can move forward in this process. and it's getting the balance between the two, and how do we leverage the trust between parties in order to move forward and achieve a just transition for all. So within the context of, let's say, the UAE itself, the UAE does have a net zero strategy, a strategy for 2030 and for 2050. And we are also in the process of developing a net zero world within the UAE. And that is how we would be working towards weaning off the concept, weaning off fossil fuels, and focusing more on renewables within the region, or within the UAE itself. So it is definitely something that we are working towards, and then alongside on the international front, or in the multilateral front, I just wanted to pick up on the concept of trust, and how that is really important for us to regain that within this process for us to move forward.